Welcome, and thanks for joining us for our Michigan gubernatorial candidate interviews. I'm Nolan Finley from the Detroit News and Detroit Public Television. Today, we're interviewing Republican Senator Pat Colbeck, who is a candidate in the Republican primary. Senator Colbeck of Canton Township is in his final year of his second term, representing the 7th District in northwestern Wayne County. Our questions today will come from a panel from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. The DJC is made up of 6 media outlets: Detroit Public Television, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, WDET Radio, New Michigan Media, and Chalkbeat. And we'd also like to thank the Knight Foundation for its support of our project. Today's panel includes Aaron Einhorn, Bureau Chief, Chalkbeat Detroit; Riley Beggin, Politics Reporter, Bridge Magazine; Stephen Carmody, Reporter-Producer, Michigan Radio; Hassan Khalifa, Reporter, Arab American News and Michigan Media, New Michigan Media; and Sandra Svoboda of WDET FM. So let's get started with our first question. Senator Colbeck, every governor brings his or her own style of leadership to the office. How would you describe your leadership style, your approach to getting people to work together?
Well, first and foremost, my background's in engineering, so I have a different sort of problem-solving approach where I actually try to find the best solution, not just a solution. So a lot of the problem-solving you're faced with as a state senator is pretty much a true-false exam. You're given one bill, you get a chance to vote up and down on it, and I have a different approach to going off and putting forward good policy. I try to frame what the actual problem statement is, so I often work in PowerPoint first, and I go off and highlight what are all the objectives we're trying to achieve. And then I go into engineering trade study mode, and I identify what are all the possible ways of achieving these objectives. That's a little bit different than what you see up in Lansing, and it's something that I think citizens are looking forward to. So the key is to get agreement on what are all the common objectives first. And when we went into this social studies standards recently, that's exactly how I did it in a group that had a lot of people with diametrically opposed worldviews, and we started off with common objectives. Those were make sure that we had standards that were politically neutral and that were also accurate. And that's the way I approach a lot of the problems, and it works very well. It's worked well in my professional career as a management consultant, including 6 years on my own as a small business owner.
As governor, you will also be leader of the party that nominated you.
Yeah.
What sort of obligation do you feel to carry out the agenda of that party?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we kind of restore an appreciation for our platform. And a lot of politicians, it's like there's this little divide, and I think in both of the parties, between what the platform is and what the fraternity is. And I think we've kind of strayed away from some of the aspects of the platform, which is, for the Republican Party, it's living within your means. It's a no-tax platform. It's a follow the Constitution platform. And I think it's important that we get people recalibrated around that. As leader of the party, we're going to make sure that we promote candidates that are actually supporting the platform, not going off and playing the good old boys network.
Thank you. We're going to turn next to education, and our first question will come from Aaron Einhorn.
Good.
Hi, Senator.
Hey.
We heard from several people in our audience who had questions about education.
Yeah.
Judith specifically wanted to know about your plans for schools. So do you believe that schools in Michigan have the resources they need to succeed to serve all students, including those with special needs? And do you think that schools are funded equitably?
Let me address the funding aspect. Yes, I do. But I tell you what, for the folks that think we're not funded adequately, I've actually got a way to go off and approach that problem in a way that gets to my core philosophy on education, is that education should not be managed centrally from the federal government or by the state government. It should be focused on the parents, the teachers, and the students. And what I mean by that is getting rid of this onerous testing that's happening, statewide testing. When I grew up, we didn't have something called the MEAP. We didn't have a statewide assessment. We would take the Iowa test and we'd take the California test to get some sort of a national benchmark as to where we were headed, but we didn't need a statewide assessment. And that's part of where this micromanagement comes from. education, as somebody who served on the Senate Education Policy Committee and also served on the school board for Canton Charter Academy as treasurer, I understand how education works in the state. And essentially, you have a 5-layer cake in education. You got the standards bone connected to the assessment bone, connected to the curriculum bone, and then lesson plans and course materials. The bottom 3 have historically always been in the domain of the local school districts, yet we've been trying to take over more and more with the state level and the federal level up at the standards and assessment level, which drives what the curriculum is. I want to knock that off and actually get back to that local control of the teachers and the parents in the classroom. That's one of the reasons I'm also a big advocate for school choice. And so if you have all the local options, well, you got to give those students and those parents some options so that if they're not getting their needs met, maybe they've got a special needs student that they want to take somewhere where they're going to get a IEP that actually is followed through on. Maybe they should have the ability to go off and be portable with those funds to go off and get their student the proper education. That's why I implemented what I call the Enhanced Michigan Education Savings Program plan. It's like an education savings account. And what it does is expands the current provisions of the Michigan Education Savings Program into K through 12 services, as well as postgraduate services. So if I want to go into skilled trades, if I want to go off and have a professional development change or a professional development courses or a career change later on, it incentivizes education as a lifelong endeavor. And the beautiful thing about these student-specific accounts is that it opens the doors for third-party funding of student-specific accounts and student-specific educational needs. So, for example, in Detroit, we've got Cornerstone and Cristo Rey schools that are private schools. They don't benefit from this program at all, but they were used as a model for how this could work for public schools. They'll have work-study programs in high school where third-party companies will come up and partner with a student and say, in exchange for you working 5 days a month in my business, getting valuable experience, I'll put in $7,000 a year towards your education. Now that, if you were to apply that into the public school realm and open the doors for these partnerships to provide student-specific accounts that they could put this funding towards, that opens the door to almost a 50% increase in foundation allowance. The big rub of this, and why I've gotten some opposition from the AFT of Michigan, was that the parents are the ones in control where that funding goes. It's not the education bureaucracy. So there are paths to get more funding if you want them, but the key is to put the control back into the hands of the customers of education, which are the parents and students. And but bottom line is, I want to go to pure local control, and it doesn't get more local than the parents being in charge of where that money goes. We definitely need to get the state and the feds out of it. And I'm a big proponent of eliminating Common Core standards and taking some hits for proposing that. But the more you learn about it, the more that drives everything that's going down at the local level in that 5-layer cake. And it's something that we actually lose some of that local control with that standard philosophy.
So following up on the standardized testing question, or this issue, research shows that test scores are often determined or driven by socioeconomic and other factors. So, how well do you think the state's current accountability system, how fairly is it measuring schools? And do you think that our current accountability system is a good way to determine whether a school should be closed?
Well, just to be clear, ultimately the accountability I'm most concerned about is accountability to the parents. Now, to the extent that you can provide parents with better information as to what's going on with an individual school or individual school district, I've supported, in theory, the concept of having different letter grades, not one rank file letter grade system, but having a letter grade on school growth, another one on achievement, another one on socioeconomic conditions, so that everybody can understand what they're getting into in a particular a school. So it's, in other words, you're informing the consumer. And so from that perspective, I'd support something of improved accountability on it. But the problem when you get into that mess is that now all of a sudden you are pushing for, it's not just what the end game is, it's what are all the intermediate steps necessary to get to that point. And when you go down that point, like teacher tenure reform, for example, we definitely needed to stop practices like last in, first out, where we were eliminating some of our best teachers in the classroom. But the solution that they came up with required that you had to start grading the teachers and assessing the teachers. Well, in order to do that, you need to go off and do an assessment. Well, it's that assessment that led to this statewide standard approach and the micromanagement of the classroom by the state and by the federal government. So while the accountability framework that you're kind of alluding to sounds good, and I'd like to have all that information out for parents, keep in mind what happens in order to implement that system. It forces that statewide assessment, because now I'm getting to the point where, all right, I'm going to do achievement, so I got to, unless you're just going to grade the socioeconomic conditions, if that's the only thing you're going to do, forget what I'm going to say here next. But if you're going to go off and start grading the achievement and the growth of that particular school, now all of a sudden you're pointing to a statewide assessment. And just be careful what you wish for is what it comes down to. I'm a big proponent that ultimately it's the customers who determine what the quality is. If you want to find out whether or not a school is good or not, you go in and talk to the teachers. You talk to the teachers in classes that are not in that are not the teachers that your students are going to be in, because they're the ones who know what goes on in their classroom. Better yet, talk to the teachers in the grade level above the teacher that you're in right now, because they'll tell you whether or not the students were prepared for for their classroom. So there's a lot of different ways to go off and approach accountability. As an engineer, I started looking at the idea of a statewide assessment. I'm going, yeah, I could get behind we have ASHRAE standards or something that are standardized, but ultimately what it comes down to is I want the individual parent saying, yeah, that was a good job or not a good job.
Thanks.
Do you think Michigan should make changes to laws regarding how charter schools are governed and how they're funded?
No, I think what we should do, and actually I've faced this early on in my state senate career. I mean, a lot of people on the Democrat side are proposing to eliminate charter schools altogether, which is essentially saying, hey, we know better about the education of your kids than you do, so talk to the hand parent. We don't care what you really have to say. So I have a little problem with that. But when it comes down to these false narratives around charters not playing under the same rules as a lot of the public schools, when I first got into the Senate, I asked my staff to go off and provide a matrix of all the Michigan compiled laws in different categories, everything from transportation to funding levels to curriculum requirements, all the way across the board. And we put out this table and we posted it to everybody and said, here's what it says for public school academies, which is what charter schools are, and they are public schools. They're not private schools like some people bogusly assert. And I said, here's the requirements for homeschoolers. Here's the requirements for parochial. Here's the requirements for traditional public schools. None of the differences that people start to highlight are evident by what's actually in law. And so I just encourage people to do their homework on what the differences are. And they talk about funding levels and requirements, and they say, oh, you get to pick and choose at a charter school. It's a lottery system, which is a horrible way to go off and determine your kid's future, frankly.
What can the state do about the high cost of childcare and the lack of preschool options for young children?
That's a tough thing to go off and do. But number one, I mean, it gets down to a fundamental discussion over social issues like the sanctity of marriage and the appreciation for families. I mean, because a lot of the reason you need a lot of these assistance, we've broken down an appreciation for the traditional family unit. And so if you have a mom that's working, for example, dad can stay home and take care of the kids. If you've got a dad that's working, mom can stay home and take care of the kids. We had a family structure that used to take care of some of those needs. Now, having said that, there are people that are going through transition phases and they're struggling with that care, and I want to make sure that we take care of them. But we got to look at some of the long-term solutions and not just the kind of quick fixes and throw money at it and provide some of these institutions to take care of it. I really want to make sure we get at the underlying root cause of this.
And finally, Sandy.
We talked about K-12 earlier. You just answered the question about early child care. On the other end of the public education spectrum, costs in higher education, are they prohibitively high among colleges and universities, and what could you do as governor about that?
Well, they are prohibitively high, and if you actually look at them, I mean, one of the studies I saw says that they're increasing the rate, the expenses at universities are increasing at the rate 5 times the rate of inflation everywhere else. I'm sorry, but there's just nothing inside a university that drives up or that is unique to them that would substantiate a increase on that level. So what I would propose is that the state would actually have more oversight over the universities. Right now they have essentially constitutional immunity for anything regards to fiduciary matters inside the universities, I would open that up, and I've got a resolution on the Senate floor right now that's designed to do just that. It's amend the Constitution so that the state would have more statutory oversight over university operations.
Thank you, Senator. You're term limited as a state senator.
Yep.
Along
very
with
thankful for
two-thirds
that.
of
Yep.
along with 2/3 of your colleagues
Yep.
and a good chunk of the House. Do you think term limits are working in Michigan, or has it cheated the state of the expertise of people like yourself?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that think they know more than they do up in, in legislative, and it's a lot of folks that are not necessarily looking out for the best interests of the people. So I'm okay with the term limits the way they are right now. 2 terms good enough for George Washington, good enough for me. And but there's an issue overall with people's priorities up in Lansing, and when you turn it over on a more frequent basis, you have an opportunity to get some fresh blood in there with a fresh perspective. But I'm okay with term limits.
Okay, let's move to roads and infrastructure. Riley?
Senator, anyone who drives Michigan roads knows that they're bad. A task force says that we need $4 billion more just to maintain them. How should Michigan pay to fix roads, bridges, and water systems?
Well, first of all, it's not about the money. A lot of people are pushing that, and when they did a transportation study, I think it was back in 2006 or 2008 timeframe, they did a calculation of how much money do we need to go off and fix our roads. Well, they didn't just include how much money we need to fix the roads. Every time they did that, they put a little jobs figure. And what happens is a lot of people are looking at transportation as a jobs program, not as a public service. And so there's a lot of Keynesian economic fans that would go off and say, well, we just got to throw more money at it. Here's what happened when we proposed a $2 billion tax increase, and I opposed this at the time. It was proposal 2015-1, and it was for a $2 billion tax increase. I was very vocal in opposition to that. I know Nolan was critical of me for doing that, but I highlighted that in that first year, only $400 million of that $2 billion, actually $1.7 billion the first year, would have actually gone towards the roads. People are using the roads issue because everybody experiences it on a daily basis. They're using it as a basis of a bait and switch. What happened as soon as 81% of the people voted no against that proposal? They went off and proposed a tax increase without a vote of the people, a $600 million tax increase. And right after that was passed, they repurposed $400 million in general fund that was allocated to the transportation budget to go backfill potholes and Medicaid expansion. It was never about the roads. This money issue is never about the roads. It's about people having more walking around money for other priorities. Now, the way to fix the roads is by focusing upon quality. It was about 4 weeks ago that I-696 had a segment of it paved, and 2 weeks later, they dug it back up again because of poor quality. That's probably got the record for the shortest lifespan of any road here in the state of Michigan. But it focuses on the issue that we are not promoting quality in process. When I talk to Ohio road officials, they have an in-process road inspection for every single road project that goes on in the state. We don't have that appreciation. What we do is we let them go off and finish the road and then say, hey, you screwed up afterwards, so go fix it. You're going to be subject to all these different fines. Well, those fines don't fix the roads. Those fines don't help people deal with these orange barrels on a regular basis. But they do go off and feed government, and that's not what we're trying to do. We need to get roads back into the mode of being focused on being a public service. There's advanced road construction techniques that I've spearheaded in my tenure in the Michigan that would actually help the roads last 3 to 4 times as long for about 15% more upfront in labor and materials. If you actually were to deploy this and convert all of our version 1 lousy roads into version 2 high quality, long lasting roads, you'd actually need less money to maintain our roads, not more.
As the recovery efforts continue in Flint, what have you learned from the situation there, and how would that inform your role as governor?
Well, first of all, if you're going to assume the role as emergency manager, you're becoming the mayor of that city. I mean, you got to be up close and personal for that particular municipality, which means you've got to measure key quality of life metrics on a regular basis. So we had a case where when that water was turned over, we had it was 6 months before they decided, hey, let's go monitor the water quality. As an engineer, I know that's way too long. And as budget chair of the State Police and Department of Military and Veterans Affairs budget, I actually did something rather unique. I focused on performance for those organizations. And actually set up, instead of the annual review of the budget and how they're performing, I would actually set up quarterly metrics reviews, and I'd say, here are your goals, here's the money you're getting, here are the services we're expecting, here's the quality we're expecting for each one of them. And I said, every 3 months we're going to be checking back with you to see how you're doing against that. Even if we were to take that, I want to do that approach for all the agencies, but if you're going to take over emergency manager responsibilities, you've at least got to have that sort of attention to detail for how you're managing that those city operations on the key metrics for the key services you're providing to your constituents.
Senator Colbeck, as the Great Lakes state, water quality is essential to our identity, and we're going to address
Yep.
that issue next with a question from Steve.
Hello, Senator.
Yep.
Several people in our audience have had questions about and concerns about the water that our state relies on. Let's start with the big question
Yeah.
that comes from Lori. She calls the Great Lakes our most critical resource. What will you do as governor to safeguard that resource?
Well, I talked about monitoring metrics. So one of the key metrics can be water quality all across the state, not just over in our Great Lakes, which I truly appreciate, but also in our rivers, in our aquifers, all the way around the state. So wherever we have water that's being used for the quality of life of our citizens, we're going to go off and monitor it. And that's what our chief role here is in government, is to actually monitor the things that impact the lives of our citizens the most and secure their rights.
M, Steve, and Daniel in our audience want to know about your plans for the future of Enbridge Line 5.
Well, first of all, you need to have a discussion over whether or not you want any fluids to go from point A to point B at all. If you do want any fluids, whether gas, natural gas, whether it's just water, from point A to point B, the most reliable way, as an engineer who's done lots of failure modes and effects analyses and reliability analyses in my work on space station and a few other things, the most reliable way to get fluids from point A to point B is with a pipe. So if you recognize that you need to get fluids from point A to point B, a pipeline is the most efficient way of doing it. If you do it via freighter, there's all kinds of opportunities for accidents. Everybody knows Exxon Valdez, right? And that's something we don't want to repeat on our Great Lakes. We know about truck accidents on a regular basis, jackknife trucks. That stuff happens on a much more frequent basis, and rail disasters happen all the time as well. Pipeline, pretty quiet. And it is the most reliable way of doing this. Now, having said that, you got to make sure you're maintaining the pipe, right? And you got to protect it. And so I appreciate some of the discussions around protecting the pipeline, either by burying it or putting a little shroud on the outside of it. There's a lot of simple ways to go off and secure those lines. But overall, we need to. A pipeline is the most effective way to get from point A to point B.
What do you do? Excuse me. How do you intend to combat water contamination caused by industrial chemicals like PFAS?
Well, first of all, you monitor it and you understand where you're actually getting contamination, making sure that people are held responsible when they actually do that. I've got an issue with vinyl chloride spill here in my district right now at a plant in Livonia. And so what I've been working with DEQ and also DHHS on is, how do you determine what a clean bill of health is for the people that are in that community? Because there's a health issue associated with it. There's also a property value issue, because they're going to try to sell their home, and they've got the issue of a vinyl chloride spill in their neighborhood. So what I've done is come up with an approach to DHHS and DEQ, and I said, I want to come up with a good housekeeping seal of approval. So that says that I know that these homes right here are safe because they meet some minimum essential threshold or whatever of safety on particular vinyl chloride levels, and then also the same thing in regards to property values. I want to be able to say that these are well within acceptable levels for any sort of transaction or sale of that home. So I try to work with it to get back to the homeowners and get them some peace of mind first and foremost. And if that involves remediation on the part of the offending party, then we'll make sure that there's remediation steps taken and hold them accountable.
Senator, should the state allow additional withdrawals from the Great Lakes Basin by bottled water companies?
As long as we're not impacting the overall quality of life. I think a lot of people are talking about the Nestlé property in particular. And ultimately, this is a case where I don't know how many people would like to go on, the government to come onto your property and say, you know, all that food you're growing in the back in your private garden, you know, you have to make sure that a certain portion of it goes to somebody else. That's kind of a difficult case to make. I mean, we have property rights, and Nestlé, as long as they're being a good neighbor to their neighbors and they're not lowering the water levels of the rivers, they're not lowering the water levels of nearby aquifers for their neighbors, if they're not lowering the overall Great Lakes levels, which, by the way, are at record highs right now, and I think we got to appreciate the fact that property rights are something that are supposed to be protected.
Let's move to immigration with a question from Hassan.
You're the state senator of a highly diverse city of Canton. The Governor Snyder introduced the Michigan Office for New Americas in 2014,
Yeah.
and established June as the month for new immigrants in Michigan. How would you attract more people to come to Michigan, given that there's a possible population decline and we might lose a congressional seat because
Yeah.
of that?
Well, the best way to attract people to Michigan is through economic policy. My elimination of state personal income tax and senior pension tax gets us to the point where we're 0% income tax, 6% sales tax. A lot of the people, and when I graduated from the University of Michigan, I went to Alabama, I went to Florida, and both of those places are much better economic conditions than what we had at Michigan at the time. They were growing as states. Matter of fact, they were right-to-work states, and it was one of the reasons that they're growing so well, and that's one of the reasons I pushed for Michigan to become the 24th right-to-work state. So the best way is to have an attractive business environment where we've got jobs for them to come to. This isn't something that we want to just promote government assistance or population for the sake of population. We got to get people back here working. And a lot of families back in the lost decade under Governor Granholm were pushed out of the state because of bad economic policies. The way to reverse that trend is by eliminating the senior pension tax and the state income tax. I think you'll see a lot of people wanting to stay here in Michigan and bring up their families.
As a follow-up to that, I'd like to know if you plan to you have refugees as part of that plan, and if you support the EB-5 program.
Well, back when we had the Syrian refugee and Governor Snyder put his finger on the pause button, I issued support for that, and because I actually found out how they were actually screening refugees to come here into the state of Michigan, and there was no attention to the security. This is coming from Syria. This is a land of ISIS. So one of the S's in ISIS is Syria. And so we want to go off and understand who are we transplanting here to the state of Michigan. Now there's some genuine refugees that have their lives threatened over there. And they're from a lot of different races and creeds out there as well, including Muslims. Because a lot of Muslims were persecuted by ISIS as well because they weren't Muslim enough, if you know what I mean. So I want to screen people so that we make sure that they're actually interested in becoming American. If they want to come here and resettle, then it's about assimilating into American culture. It's not about setting up, unique cultures. My grandparents came over. My grandma came from Poland. My grandpa came from Ukraine, and they kept their culture. I mean, I have my pierogi and my kielbasa and my sauerkraut and my guamki back at home, and I love that kind of stuff. We had that. But ultimately, they learned English. They got to work. He started out working at a gas station, then ended up owning his own gas station, and that's what we need to get an appreciation for. So anybody coming here, we want them to become Americans, and so that's one of the things that I'd be focused on. It's not just bring people for the sake of relocating and increasing population. It's a matter of bringing them over here because they appreciate the opportunities we are afforded as Americans, and they want to be part of that American society.
Senator, what role can immigration play in meeting the workforce needs of Michigan's employers?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of the visa programs, especially for farm communities and the migrant workers, is something that's been very important. They've actually offered, I've talked to a lot of farmers where they've tried to put Medicaid enrollees on there. They last maybe 2 weeks and say, this is too hard, I want to leave. Well, that doesn't leave too many people that are willing to go off and work in those environments. And so there is an opportunity where there are jobs that apparently there are Americans that are here, that are able-bodied, that are just unwilling to go off and fill. And for those, we do need to pick our crops, and we need to go off and support that. There's other skilled areas, maybe in software engineering, that we've got some deficiencies of. There's a whole spectrum where Where we've got a skill deficiency that needs to be filled, by all means, I think we should look at maybe bringing some folks in. But the idea of immigration for the sake of immigration and just population increases for the sake of population increases is not a good policy to have. I think it's got to be more demand-driven.
And one other thing that might influence immigration in Michigan in the future, the 2020 census and the citizenship question. How do you see that impacting the state?
Well, I think it's important to ask whether or not somebody's a citizen or not, especially because we're apportioning voting privileges based on that, and your voting influence based on that, and you have to be a citizen in order to vote. So I think it's very important to be asking that question. And as far as what the impact is, I mean, whether or not, whatever the impact is, it's the right thing to do from a rule of law perspective.
Let's talk taxes now, Riley.
Many people in our audience want to know about taxes, insurance, and finance issues. From our audience member, John, do you believe that economic development deals with tax credits, incentives, etc. are necessary and useful for Michigan's communities? What's your position on tax incentives?
Heck no. It's been one of those areas that's probably been the most frustrating policy area in my tenure in the Michigan Senate. Mackinac Center recently put out a survey of the records of legislators in regards to what they call crony subsidies. And so if you had a 100% rating, it means that you never saw a crony subsidy that you didn't like and you voted for every single one of them. And Bill Schuette got a 100% rating, Brian Kelly got a 95% rating, I got a 3.5% rating, and that was the best record of any state senator in 2 decades. And by the way, of that 3.5%, one of them was for a place that they were counting on that subsidy because a new company had bought that company, and if I would have said no to it, the people that were already working at that company, so it wasn't an incentive to set up a new shop, people that were already working there would have lost their jobs, and I couldn't do that in that case. But that's where the 3.5 comes from. But I believe that the best approach to economic development is broad-based economic development. I'm a management consultant for 11 years. My job's been to go off and turn around business operations for a lot of different companies. And if you want to turn them around and get them into a job growth mode, the best way to do is lower the total cost of business operations. And you can do that by lowering the cost of government, which means eliminating state personal income tax. You can do it by lowering the cost of health care, which is something I've been a big proponent, and not just statewide, but nationally recognized by Forbes.com on free market healthcare solutions. And then lowering the cost of electricity by promoting energy choice, where you can get 10 to 20% less on your electricity rates than you would under the regulated utility market. So that's the way to incentivize economic development. I'm opposed to about $1 billion in handouts that we give every single year towards what I believe is more cronyism.
Steve?
In all likelihood, sometime over the next 4 years, we're going to probably be back into a recession.
Oh, don't call that out by faith.
How would you prepare the state so that it's ready if the economy does a downturn in the next 4 years?
Diversification, and the way you get diversification is not by mandating a diverse portfolio. A lot of top-down central planners like to go off and do that. The way you get that diversification is actually by getting government out of the way. You'll notice that every time they put together an incentive program in Lansing, it's like, okay, this year we're going to incentivize films. Next year, now we're going to incentivize batteries. Oh, now we're going to incentivize data centers. They try to play SimCity with our state and try to micromanage everybody's lives. No, the way to do this and the way to incentivize it and prepare us for the future is to let people be driven by their own passions and in regards to what they want to pursue in the business realm. And that's when you get the biggest success stories. That's when you get somebody like a Henry Ford kicking off into some area that never was really, it wasn't an industry before. The auto industry wasn't a real industry, if you would, before he got engaged on it. We want to incentivize all those new ideas, and the way to do that is by getting the government out of the way.
Debbie and Ray in our audience want to know your plans for car insurance. Specifically, what would you do to lower rates?
Well, all right. This comes into a recognition of what the debate's been to date. First of all, no fault got instituted because a lot of people said we had too many claims going into the court system, was bogging it down, so let's just pretend that nobody's at fault and make sure we take care of everybody. Well, that hasn't worked. We actually have more claims in the court system now than we used to. It's just different types of claims. They're based on making sure people get their full health benefits. So the reason we haven't got any movement off dead center in the legislature is because it devolves into a debate between folks who want lower costs, which I'm definitely in that category, and folks that want lifetime benefits. So if you're injured and you got a traumatic brain injury, that's kind of a life-altering scenario that you want to make sure your insurance is taken care of. Well, I believe we should meet both of those requirements. And to date, it's always been seen as one or the other. I'm an engineer. I like to approach things from a different perspective. And if you take both of those as requirements, I started looking at how could you actually go off and satisfy both of those, sometimes treated as diametrically opposed requirements. And the secret is looking into my own insurance premium. When I looked at my own car insurance premium, it turned out 58% of my costs were due to state mandates. You eliminate the state mandates, which essentially means you go back to a tort-based system, you eliminate no fault as we know it, and then you repurpose the funds associated with the Michigan Catastrophic Fund, which is a challenge. You can reduce the rates of auto insurance by close to 60%, a minimum of 40%, but I think we can get to 60% while actually retaining lifetime benefits, because the interest on that Michigan Catastrophic Fund almost covers the disbursements coming out of it for benefit claims. And that way you wouldn't need that $192 per person MCCA surcharge you see on your current insurance claim. So we can get in a little bit more detail on how that is, but the biggest challenge to get to the full 60%, involves the federal government, involves the treatment of those Michigan catastrophic funds, which is about a $20 billion corpus that's sitting there right now earning less than 2% interest on it.
Senator, would you roll back Michigan's income tax, or would you eliminate it altogether?
Eliminate it altogether, and it's about a $9.7 billion gap, and I've got a practical milestone-based approach to get us all the way down to zero. And by the way, when you eliminate the state personal income tax, you eliminate the senior pension tax, and you also eliminate the debate about fairness between people with 401k style plans and pension taxes, because neither one of them are taxed on income. And so this is not something you do with just one bill and you say, poof, income tax gone. No, this is something where you identify tangible expense-based milestones that once you achieve that milestone, you ratchet it down. Once you achieve the next one, you ratchet it down. And I believe we can get all the way down to zero by the end of my tenure as governor.
Senator Colbeck, could you give us a few of the highlights of replacing that $9.7 billion that you'd be taking away from the state in income?
First of all, everybody needs to know I'm not cutting schools, I'm not cutting police and fire, all the usual red herrings everybody throws out on this stuff. Where you start is number one at the single largest line item in our state budget, and that's Medicaid. Out of our $56.7 or so billion budget, $18 billion of it goes to Medicaid. In that line item, we actually kicked off a pilot that I got into the state budget last year for direct primary care-based Medicaid pilot. It offers the opportunity to save over 20% on the cost of Medicaid, and it does so while actually getting Medicaid enrollees better care. So here's a case where we can actually reduce expenses by improving services. Well, 20% $18 billion, about $3.6 billion. Already you're at 6.1. Then we go back to what we were talking about in economic development. And that $1 billion for Michigan Strategic Fund, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, another $1 billion off the top. Now we're down to $5.1 billion. Now if we go into economic growth, we get into the case where if we got 500,000 new private sector jobs through a pro-growth attitude here in the state again, like we've done over the last 7.5 years, now we got another $1.9 billion net to the positive with the elimination of need for government assistance plus increased sales tax revenue, use tax revenue, property tax revenue.
What role would criminal justice reform play in that savings?
Reduction of recidivism could actually reduce it by another $300 million. I mean, as you know, it's our largest line item for general fund money in the state budget, so it means it's the most fungible money we have in the state budget. So that is an opportunity to significantly reduce the cost of...
Have you thought about how you reduce recidivism?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons I'm on the Criminal Justice Policy Commission, is to identify the different data streams that identify what programs are working to reduce recidivism and which ones are not working. And I've actually been pretty systematic about identifying. Matter of fact, unfortunately, Governor vetoed one of my bills to get a lot of that data out into the system, but ultimately, there's a lot of particular faith-based programs that have been shown to cost very little up front, if anything, and actually reduce recidivism down in the single digits. So that's one way of going off and approaching it. Whatever the program is, if you can show how effective it is at keeping people out of this rotating door of prison, we can drastically reduce the cost of our correction system.
So in the question about tax incentives, you talked about getting government out of the way and out of the market, letting the companies develop on their own.
Yeah.
But as Michigan competes to become the mobility capital, the autonomous driving capital, and competes with places like Silicon Valley, is there a role for government in helping foster and grow this new industry?
Yeah, and marketing, and go off and highlight what are all the assets we already have in place that can facilitate mobility discussion here in the state of Michigan. We got great universities with excellent students coming out there. Unfortunately, they're all going elsewhere because of the rest of the quality of life aspects, including our income tax rates, are so high. So yeah, you market what we do have as an asset. When I talk about broad-based economic development, and what it does is kind of like everybody goes and incorporate inside of Delaware, and they don't care whether or not you're a mobility corporation, an energy corporation, pharmaceutical, whatever. A lot of people go to Delaware to incorporate because it's no hassle and it's low cost. We set up Michigan so that pure Michigan becomes associated with it's easy to do business in the state. We promote, we don't get in your way, we don't get in your knickers. We go off and promote what is best for you to go off and thrive in our state. That sends a message to all different types of business, not just mobility, which is the latest fad of the, it sets it up for businesses that nobody's even dreamed of yet.
Let's stay on mobility, but in terms of public transit, we've got a diverse state between the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, Detroit and other urban areas with population density and mass transit systems. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your specific plans, both for the urban areas and regional transit, specifically in Southeast Michigan, and then also the rest of the state and rural areas, and what might be in the works for those regions.
All right, well, I'm not a fan of the Regional Transit Authority out in Michigan, in Southeast Michigan in particular right now. And part of the reason is because they never really solved the core problem. They just kind of put another layer on top of two existing.
What's the core problem?
The core problem is legacy costs associated with those and delivering effective services. And frankly, when you start talking about mass transit, there are major disruptors out there that if the state goes in and puts in some major investments in infrastructure along those lines, well, where does that leave room for the next Uber of the world or the Lyft of the world that actually has an innovative way of maybe delivering some of these services in a way free from government entanglements, and they actually provide better quality services that meet the needs of consumers. So the idea of the state getting in the middle of that, I know that in Europe they've over many years, frankly with a lot of assistance from the United States, they've got some pretty good mass transit systems that are put in place, and I love taking advantage of that when we have it in place, but we need to make sure that the people that are receiving the services are also the ones that are paying for those services. And a lot of the proposals that I've seen to date set it up so that somebody else pays for it and somebody else receives the benefit. Now, this could be part of an overall plan to go off and help folks. We were talking about earlier with childcare and the idea of getting people transportation to work, effective transportation to work, and there might be some room in that context, but we got to be careful about becoming too heavy-handed as a state and investing heavily in that infrastructure, because I think there's a lot of innovative disruptors like the Lyfts and the Ubers out there that might have a different approach to it that might satisfy our needs better.
Riley has a question about transparency.
Yeah, what's your stance on the ballot measure to create an independent commission for redistricting? And if you oppose the Voters Not Politicians initiative, what solution would you suggest instead to address gerrymandering?
Well, first of all, everybody needs to recognize that proposal is not about the voters. It is about gerrymandering, and it's about the Democrats trying to gerrymander the election process. When you actually Devin Skillian was on Channel 4. He actually interviewed the person who was actually promoting this and leading this effort. And when he asked him, why are you doing this? And said, well, we weren't getting the election results we wanted. That sounds like a gerrymandering purpose to me, doesn't it? And so I think that the system is working just fine right now. Actually, if you look at my Senate district, it's about as close as you can get to a box as you're ever going to find. Maybe they kept it nice and orthogonal for this engineer to go off and get his hands around it, and they left the more creative ones to more artistic folks that are out there. But I think the system that we have right now is working fine, and people are going to go off and cite a bunch of examples of different things that are going on. Well, a lot of those creative lines that are drawn are actually based on Democrat policies, and that are actually in statute that we have to comply with when we go off and put together those lines. So
You mean the Voting Rights Act?
yeah. And so, I mean, if you actually set it so you based on geography rather than demographics, it has a different look, because everybody is sensitive to the geometry of the districts. That's where everybody is getting so incensed by it and how crazy it is. But they need to realize that those gerrymandered districts are actually driven by demographic profiles, and people, don't migrate into a box. They migrate along some, meandering lines sometimes. And so if you want orthogonal boxes, well, the Voting Rights Act is what's driving that. Get rid of that. But I'm not proposing to do that either. I'm just saying, let's leave it the way it is, stop politicizing the process, and just focus on executing the process.
Thanks.
Sandra?
Michigan recently received the lowest rating among all the states for the transparency that is here. So assuming you think that's a problem, I don't want to put words in your mouth,
Okay.
but what efforts would you initiate related to the Freedom of Information Act, making state local records more available, maybe campaign finance reform and disclosure, and other transparency efforts that might boost our rating in that regard?
Well, first and foremost, I actually sponsored my first year, I think, in the state Senate, transparency legislation that talked about how all the money we were spending in the state was spent. And so if you go to 10millionaccountants.com, you can actually see the spending plans in detail, and in a way that's presented in a way that you can actually do some data mining and understand how exactly all the money that's spent in state government is actually spent. And I think its first priority is that our citizens need to know how the state funds that we're responsible for appropriating are spent. The next area where it gets into transparency around campaign finances, it'd be nice to be able to take all the money out of politics. I've done that my own special way in this election to take money out of politics. But the key is people need to recognize that that money provides you a voice out in the public square. Unless TV stations are going to provide free advertising, folks who may have a different point of view from the folks who are controlling the airways, who are going off and talking on a regular basis from a different worldview, if they're pushing a particular candidate, whether it's a newspaper, whether or not it's a TV station or whatever, there's no accountability on those funds. And that's what we're competing against with the idea of fundraising. You got to be able to buy ad time on those same places where they're pushing one or a different candidate or a different worldview on it, and you need that money to go off and compete. If there was accountability on that end too, and we all know there's very much a distinct bias in the media, it's been proven time and time again. For a guy like me who's a conservative, it's tough to get the message out.
And let me follow that up with the Freedom of Information Act. There have been proposals to apply it to the legislature and the governor's office.
Yeah.
What could we expect from your administration on that issue?
Well, I mean, a lot of the salaries and everybody, if anybody wants to know how anybody's making money or whatever in my office or whatever, my personal salary, that's fine. The idea of going off and going on fishing expeditions, which is what Robert Mueller's doing right now with President Trump, a lot of people are using the Freedom of Information Act as a political weapon, not as something to keep people accountable. And I think you've got to have safeguards in it so that folks like Robert Mueller wouldn't be able to do the same thing into state legislators or a state governor's office and essentially use their authority and abuse their authority to just go on fishing expeditions. Because Joseph Stalin had a famous quote once. He said, "You show me the man, I'll show you the crime." And there's a book out there that says 3 felonies a day. There's so many rules out there, so many regulations. It is so easy to go off and get somebody to trip up. I mean, since we've been in here on this interview, I bet you somebody's broken a law along the lines here in this area. And the key is whether or not that is something that merits public scrutiny, merits a lot of those resources, or whether or not it's something that should be delved into and somebody should be held accountable. We have a very low standard for some of those searches, as exemplified by this Robert Mueller investigation.
Senator Colbeck, we want to ask you a few questions on social issues, starting with Steve on marijuana.
Yeah.
This fall, Michiganders vote on recreational marijuana.
Yeah.
What's your feeling on that? Do you support it? Are you opposed to it? And if it does pass, how will your administration implement it?
Yeah, I was opposed to the expansion of medical marijuana provisions. I thought what the people put into the statute was fine, just at 2.5 ounces, 12 plants. That was reasonable because when you're talking about marijuana, it's still a controlled substance. You can't use the bank for it, so it's a cash-only business. I'd rather have people walking around with 20s and than having them walk around with Brinks cars, which is what happened under the medical marijuana expansion. At the time medical marijuana was expanded against my my vote, I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I heard all the testimony around it. I opposed it because there's so much money being thrown into this business that I think the election's being bought. I think the ballot's being bought. I think people are not given the full story about what the impacts are. They're only being talked about what the positives are, and everybody loves new tax revenue, and they're pitching that. They're not focused on what the increased expenses are going to be. And so this recreational marijuana ballot initiative, I'm opposed to for a variety of reasons. Number one, we've got issues with folks driving under the influence of alcohol. I don't want to add people driving under the influence of marijuana to that equation. Second of all, I've got 31,000 job openings in my district right now. We want to grow our economy. If we go off and pass recreational marijuana, people are going to have to pass drug tests to get employment. That number that I have of open job openings here in my district is going to go up. When that number of job openings goes up, the number of people on government assistance is also going to go up because they can't find a job because they can't pass a drug test. That is a bad recipe for Michigan's future from my perspective. Having said that, if they do pass it and they vote to pass it and put it on and get it into so that we're a recreational marijuana state, we'll find a way to make it work. We'll find a way to make it safe for everybody, but it puts in jeopardy a lot of the things that we would like to do for our economy and for the quality of life here for Michigan residents.
Senator, the two perennially contentious issues in this state and in this country are abortion and gay marriage.
Yeah.
Do you see those as settled issues in Michigan, or do you think it's still an open question here?
Well, Michigan actually has on the books one of 4 states that actually has an anti-abortion law. So we're having a lot of discussion around Supreme Court nominees right now. If Roe v. Wade were actually overturned, then Michigan would become a battleground state on abortion. Unlike the governor, I would definitely be making sure that we have prohibition on funding to Planned Parenthood. And so it's in boilerplate right now. I actually have legislation making it into statute. So I definitely support the elimination of abortion in our state. The idea of taking an innocent human life is something that's pretty abhorrent to me and should be abhorrent to everybody. In regards to gay marriage, this is another case where in our Constitution we had 2,688,000 people vote back, I think it was in 2006, for an amendment to our Constitution that said that marriage was between a man and a woman. And then we had 5 Supreme Court justices in black robes that were not elected overturn that will. I have a tough time with that, and I think there's a case where we start pursuing nullification proceedings on things that are blatantly unconstitutional rulings on the part of the Supreme Court, and we go off and address that. But having said that, there's a lot of different issues associated with it. We'll be open to the discussions, but those are kind of my views on the subject.
We have some lighter questions from our panel. Aaron?
What is the make and model of the car that you and other members of your household are currently driving?
Well, my 2008 Ford Edge is now sitting in the shop getting a new drive shaft. So technically I'm not driving it now, but it's one of my favorite cars we got in the library. And the other car that we were talking earlier about, the compacts, well, I actually drive a 2012 Ford Focus that's sitting out in the parking lot right now. And I love both those vehicles. And anyway, it's been good. I think the Ford Focus now, even though it's a 2012, has got over 212,000 miles on it so far, and that's with friends driving me all around the state.
Hassan?
Do you recall an interesting or touching moment that you experienced while talking to voters along the campaign trail?
There's tons of sensitive moments. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotes that I've gotten from a lot of my folks too out on the road. We had a gentleman just recently out in Stillman, Michigan, which is up in the UP. I had a bumper sticker on the Colbeck bumper sticker, and this guy gets out of his car, runs up to him and says, "That's my guy. That's the guy I'm voting for." And he goes, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "Not only am I voting for him, my whole GM UAW local is voting for him." And he goes, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah. You know, they told us to vote for Hillary in the last election. We all voted for Donald Trump. This time they're telling us to vote for Gretchen Whitmer. We're all voting for Colbeck." And it's stories like that that happen all over the state that kind of warm my heart. There's a lot of stuff not getting reported that's happening on the ground. that is really appreciative. Now, I can recall back in my state Senate run when I was knocking on doors and talking to somebody who was just, he just looked sad. And I sat down next to him, and he was on a rocking chair. And it wasn't on my list to go off and walk, but I saw the gentleman sitting out there and went up to him. Turned out that his wife of something like 50 years had recently passed away. And he was out there sifting through this poetry that he had written for her while he was there. So you're never supposed to spend more than 2 minutes at any door. I ended up spending about 45 minutes sitting down as he'd recite all that poetry to me. And you can tell, I mean, I don't even know if I got the guy's vote at the end of this, but you could tell it made a huge difference for him when it came, when I left. And there's so many people that are out there hurting just like that gentleman, that are looking for somebody just to give them a voice. This election's about that. It's about giving people a voice. I never wanted to go into politics. It's still my least favorite occupation I've ever had in my life, but there's so many people that do not feel like they're getting their voice out there, that I do my best to make sure that we can get that voice out. Right now I'm the only Republican state senator in Wayne County, and a lot of people in Wayne County feel like their voice is lost. They've adopted me as their state senator to go off and look into matters that their representatives are not doing. We've been kind of the land of misfit toys, where people come to us because we will listen to them because nobody else will. And those are the stories that touch my heart. I cannot stand bullies. And when the government's acting like a bully, I make sure that they're held accountable. When there's just people that are not in the government act as bullies, I make sure that they're held accountable too. So there's tons of stories we can go on. I share a lot of these stories in my book, Wrestling Gators, Outsider's Guide to Draining the Swamp. If you go through that, it's got a lot of personal stories that get into some detail on some things that actually happen. And it also talks about how government really works on the inside, which I think people would find pretty enlightening.
Riley?
What are you reading right now? What book is on your nightstand?
Well, it's my Bible every morning for the last 17 years. So that's the only thing I have time for reading, to tell you the truth. So I got Experiencing God Day by Day by Blackaby Brothers, a devotional, along with my Bible in a year.
Sandra?
Sticking on the book question a little bit, who's your favorite Michigan author? And then also, I'm interested in your favorite Michigan foods as well. So book authors and foods.
Well, my favorite Michigan foods are probably not the ones that are the best for me, but I definitely like anything with a Better Made seal on it, which my wife is very good at making sure I don't go shopping with her for a reason. In regards to Michigan books, I honestly don't look at where the author is actually from when I go off and look at the actual book, so I can't really say.
Steve?
What makes for a good weekend? What do you like to do when you're not campaigning?
I'll let you know when I get one. I honestly, for me, I've learned much more appreciation for taking the Sabbath off during campaign season than ever before. I had friends that were running for office back when I was running for Senate that they said, if you don't campaign on Sundays, you're going to lose. And I didn't campaign. I won. They lost. And I think part of it is it's you need that time to go off and recalibrate on what is truly important in life. And if you don't do that, you're missing out on how you can serve people better and more effectively and more empathetic, with more empathy. And I talk about Saturday, except frankly Saturday is like another Monday to me. So it's been a 6-day work week for a while.
Senator, one last question, and briefly, because we're running out of time, but our citizens have lost faith in government. How would you restore it?
Well, that's actually written in my book too. There's a whole chapter on how to restore our respect for a system of government. That's actually one of the reasons that I'm running, is because I want to restore an appreciation for core principles that made us a great nation and get them into the service of the people that are in elected office. And I think ultimately it means that we start prioritizing their best interests over the needs of ourselves. There's a lot of ladder climbers in politics. I think it's about time that we actually had a leader that was focused on the best interests of the people at large, the people whose voices haven't been heard in a long time, and that's what I aim to do as next governor.
Senator Patrick Colbeck, thank you. Thanks to our panel and to the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, and thanks as well to the John S. and James Knight Foundation for sponsoring our project. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. God bless you.